Thank you for that lovely introduction. I think I'm over the trauma. And thanks everybody for being here. This has been a return, or sort of to the past for me, to go back over the last 15 years maybe of work I've done in this area, and it's been really, really rewarding. And I think I'll start by saying, because I had been thinking of it, the whole thing is a failure, right? And now when I look at what we've done, I realize it was not a failure. We made tremendous progress at Georgetown with this project. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history. I think you can take everything we've heard today and just sort of map it onto what we're trying to do at Georgetown. It was, by and large, a project that came out of my own experience rather than out of any kind of intellectual understanding of graduate education. Right? I had gone to law school and I felt like my brain had been cut in half, and half of it was missing because I wasn't reading, I wasn't learning history, I was just learning very pragmatic things that could be used, out in the world and in a law firm. And only when I went back and got my PhD at University of Virginia did I start to feel like a whole person again, right? So when we started the program, that was really always on my mind, that I wanted students to be able to graduate from a master's program, but actually from a PhD program. I wanted them to be able to graduate feeling whole. Right? So I'll just give that as a little bit of background. So I just laid out these dates almost for myself because I was like, whoa, I have been doing this a very long time. So around 2012 to 2014, I was chair and we were being encouraged to develop a PhD in English. This was maybe the third time this had happened since I came to Georgetown in '94. And the previous two times it had been rejected soundly, quickly, by the faculty because of the job market. Okay, so this time it was going in that direction, and a few people got together and started talking about a public-facing component in a PhD in English. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little more about that discussion. Then 2014 to 2018, we had the Mellon Grant with ASU and Irvine and the MLA, and that was just transformative. That's what allowed me to do the work that resulted in the master's. First attempt to launch, 2019, hello COVID. We were ready to go. We recruited students, I think I had about 12 students, and it was just clear that we weren't going to have normal operations in the fall. So we waited a year. So then we did, in 2020, we re-recruited. Some of those students were still wanting to come, and that was when we accepted students, and then the first semester was the fall of 21. So now that we're into the third year, and as far as Ricardo Ortiz is directing it, and about a week ago he sent out an email saying the recruiting was going really well, looking at having 10 or 12 students, and at Georgetown, the difference between having 5 and having 10 is huge in terms of the money that we can then turn back to the students in terms of aid. Okay, so every student that comes in radically increases what we can do for all the students. So it's really important to have sort of the right enrollment enough to have that money to fund their tuition, but not so many students that we can't handle the program. So this has been really good news. So PhD discussions, and we were talking about a lot of this came up at lunch today. We developed a proposal that had, we called them pillars. It was going to be a short time to degree, right, and engaged or public humanities residency of some kind, or teaching. It was pretty flexible. A hybrid alternative dissertations would be invited, not required, but interdisciplinarity was a requirement of the program, and fully funded. All of those were what we wanted to do. And I just said advantages were obvious. it's because at that point I was pretty fixated on the idea that students needed to be able to get jobs. And students wouldn't be able to get jobs unless they had some experience outside the academy. So that was sort of where my mind was. So objections, and I list these because anyone who wants to start anything, not even a master's certificate, whatever you want to start, some of these are going to come up. Cheapens the degree, we don't know how to do this, too much extra work, that came up quite a bit. Not in public, no one would ever admit that in public, but in private. Students don't need it. You don't need a PhD to do the kind of jobs they're going to get. That was the argument. We want a traditional PhD. We don't want to be the first, too radical, it's risky, right? And it's not going to do us any good with our rankings, right? Unless it's a research-oriented PhD. So all of that. On the question of students don't need it, I always said, well, the students are far better prepared to move forward very quickly if they have the PhD. If they've had the experience of managing a dissertation, kind of changes your brain, right? You're not really the same afterwards. You can handle much more complex activities. You can manage your time much better. There's all kinds of things that happen when you write a dissertation. So I felt that for the students to move into a non-academic position and then move forward very quickly, they did need the PhD. You know, we talked about the master's last night as an alternative, and I'm still convinced that there's something different between the master's and then having to write a dissertation, right, in terms of preparation. So lots of arguments in the department, and this is the part that you're going to edit out. Okay. Very, very vicious, really. People refusing to come to meetings, hanging up on me on the phone. You know, it just got really, really ugly. And the reason I'm telling you this is because, first of all, to be prepared, right? And then secondly, to know that, you know, it can be very hard and you have to really persevere despite that difficulty if you really want to change. For a long time, I thought there would be no change, right? But now this story, just doing this PowerPoint, thank you very much for reminding me, made me realize that the institution itself has changed as a result of these activities. Now it's taken a number of years, and that's how slow universities are, but it has changed. So we get to a vote, and this is how the vote came out. 14 in favor, 10 said no, 3 abstained, 8 did not vote. Now, no is an anonymous vote, and nobody knows what, but I suspect what was going on there was the junior people who didn't have tenure were very worried about voting at all. And that's very close to the number of junior people we had at that point. And then, you know, there were people who were, you know, adamantly opposed, and that's where you get 10 votes against, right? So we had a positive vote, but we didn't have enough support really to move forward. So what did we do? I went to the provost and the dean, and their reaction was they didn't like the vote. They were worried that the department couldn't sustain it if people weren't behind it. They didn't want to spend any money, which, you know, when did they ever? Too much risk, well, it's not going to raise our standings. And I do think things would be different today. One thing that I find just so interesting about the process was the people that were the most invested in this PhD were the full-time, non-tenure line people. Okay? So the very people who had not been able to obtain tenure line jobs were the most interested in this. And they came to every meeting and they supported it. And one reason we got the vote that we did was because they had the vote in our department. Okay? Not every department does that. Okay, so there I am at the end of the semester, you know, slamming the door behind me as I leave for the summer. Right around that time, that MLA report on graduate education came out. Okay, and I read it just with disbelief. We hadn't known anything about it. We're in our little silo doing our little project, And it turned out that everything we were doing mapped onto that report, and the report mapped onto what we were doing. Okay, so the exact same pillars that I mentioned, those are all in the report. So it was Professor Berman at Stanford, and he was getting a lot of pushback on the Chronicle. So just pretty ugly responses. This was when they still allowed comments, and pretty much the same comments I was getting from my department. So I just sent our proposal to him and said, you know, this is what we were doing, and it's so great. You know, thanks for the report. And the next day, I got a call from Rosemary Field at the MLA asking me to go in on the Mellon grant. So, you know, that was just a lucky break. And we ended up with, with the Connected Academics grant. Did it for about 4 years. We kept extending this. I'm not really sure when it ever ended, but it was a great experience. We had wonderful people working from ASU and Irvine and the MLA, and the one person who's not here today was great with this, Stacy. Each unit had a different mission, and our mission was to start a PhD in public humanities, essentially. And we pursued that. Okay, next slide. Okay. We pursued that for a couple of years, trying to get the graduate school to position it in the graduate school, not in the department. And I have a slide in here somewhere, but I'll just tell you, we went through every permutation you can imagine. I wrote a proposal for a certificate and a master's, a certificate, a master's, and a PhD. A master's and a PhD, only the PhD, right? And the dean's office, just every time I went in, there was, you know, well, if you do a certificate, you're going to bleed all students from the master's. You know, if you do a PhD, we have to fund it. You know, so it was around and around and around, but we just kept going. We just kept doing it. And in the meantime, we did this sort of thing. This was our first event. It was probably the first event like this that I had ever planned. And we got an audience of maybe 70, 80 people, which was great. The dean sat in the middle of the third row like this, waving at me. We just edit this out. He's not there anymore, but you know, he was very conservative, very traditionalist. If we were going to have a PhD, he wanted a traditional PhD. This was not about that, right? This was about reinvention. So that was a pretty inspiring event. I'm gonna skip this because I'm gonna come back to it. We then had many meetings, you know, and I think only if you've done this do you realize the time commitment and the labor that goes into trying to get buy-in from these different folks. The funnest part was meeting with people from NHA, NEH, Library of Congress, the Folger, all of those organizations. They were really enthusiastic about what we were doing, and they really wanted to be part of it. And they ended up offering us, you know, internship opportunities, all kinds of site visits. It was great working with them. It's exciting to see, you know, to get out of, Georgetown is a little bit removed from downtown, to get off the hilltop and out into the city for the students and for me. It was great. Yeah, this was all the different times, all the different proposals we did. So finally, after all these meetings, it was kind of a surprise. Went to a meeting of the Graduate School Executive Council, presented it again for like the 20th time, but this time just the masters and engaged in public humanities, and they approved it. And then by June, they went to the board, and again, it was contentious, I heard afterwards, but they approved it. So then we're ready to go. Then we don't have any money, right? So we're trying to recruit students on a $5,000 budget. You don't really want to do that. But we did, you know, we figured out how to do it. If you want to do that, you need to talk to every student who makes any kind of contact, any kind of question. You need to get a grad student to work with you who has technical expertise and can do your website. I had a wonderful student from School of Foreign Service, which is one of the top schools at Georgetown, and he was like, it was seamless. He just did it before I even thought about it. And then we did do outreach to undergrad programs using, there are companies that will send out, 50,000 emails to a list of schools. And I learned so much during this. And we did do that. And the one thing I should have done was Humanities Center outreach. Because when I went online to research sort of the history of this, I found Facebook ads, and I think ads on the Obermann Center. You should go to this is great, that kind of stuff. And we could have done more with that outreach. So, let me just drink a water. I'm really losing my voice. So, the guiding principle here was to have a program that brought these two things together. Intellectual development, right, in the humanities field, the opportunity for students to dive pretty deep. Not as deep as they would obviously in a PhD, but pretty deep. And then career readiness. And those two strands to be kind of working together the entire time. So the students had 4 core courses, and a sort of introduction to the theory of public humanities, where we talk about like what does it mean to say, to use the word, the words, the humanities. What does it mean to have the public? What's your relationship with the public? All of those sorts of things. And then a more pragmatic course that introduced them to possible career paths. And then a digital humanities course and a public writing course. So 4 core courses. And then another 4 courses that they could take anywhere in the university that would accept them. And that also involved a lot of negotiation with other departments. And it was really interesting because some of the departments that were the most oppositional, who thought that they were going to lose students to our program, actually gained students and became the biggest supporters of the program. So, one thing I had to learn, I said I was going to talk about emotions because I do history of emotions. But, managing my own emotions around all of this and recognizing that people aren't so stuck as they may. It might feel like they're very stuck at the beginning, yeah. And then over time, things do change and people do change. So that was a very important learning. So the other sort of thing that was driving me, at least, and driving the program, was this whole issue of like, what's the value of the humanities? What do we make? What do we produce? How are we valued more or less differently than somebody in the sciences or somebody in the social sciences? And what I started thinking was it's not about the skills. It's not about, as you pointed out, critical reading, critical analysis. It's not about that. It's not about writing skills. It's not about project development skills. It's not about any of that. It's about habits of mind, right? That we change the way people think. And I think we need to own that, right? Because I'll tell you one thing, the law schools own that. When you start law school, the first week they tell you, 3 years you're going to be thinking an entirely different way, you're going to think like a lawyer. And I remember thinking, you're not doing that to me. But maybe I'm sort of. So the law schools really own it, and we don't own it, but we do it. Okay? So I've worked with students, worked with other faculty, and worked on, this is an ongoing project to think about like what makes us different, right? And it's not that everything on this list are things that other programs don't do, other disciplines don't do, but that we foreground these in the way that we train students. So the comfort with intellectual emotional difficulty, value for both disciplinary expertise and interdisciplinary expertise, right? Sensitivity to history. And to me, that one was so important because when I was practicing law in Atlanta, I was a public defender, and I would walk into the courthouse, and every single defendant on a preliminary hearing day would be black. And every single person working there for the state of Georgia was white. But I didn't really have the tools to do much other than just say, this isn't right, And going to graduate school actually gave me the tools to figure out what was going on, to think about the history and the culture that led to that kind of situation, which is still the situation. So that one was very important to me. Relationship between form and content. I think that's very specific to the way we read in English departments and in literature departments of foreign languages. Ability to come to conclusions even in an ambiguous and confusing context. Management of multiple levels of discourse, different registers, curiosity. These are things that other fields also have. The science is very, oriented around curiosity, but we really emphasize how to develop that. How could this idea be complicated? That's something that my dad was a PhD economist, and when I was doing my PhD, I'd written a paper, and Patricia Spax had commented on it, and she had said, you need to complicate this. And I told my dad, yeah, I wrote this paper, but I need to complicate it. And he said, complicate, keep it simple, stupid. His rule, right? So we are, the humanities complicate things, right? And that might be one of the reasons that, we get a lot of pushback. It's easier for people to think that things are simple, and they're not simple. And we're pretty good at figuring out the complexity of them. Ability to see received truths as maybes, suggest alternatives, to evaluate methodologies and denaturalize them. Interest and trust in the value of human subjectivity, attentiveness to narratives, people's stories, and then the skills. I'll put the skills at the bottom. Right? I still think they're important, but I think these habits of mind that you don't even think about and you're unconsciously absorbing when you study the humanities are what makes it important. Skills and so how do we know that this master's has been successful? Enrollments, and we just get a lot of interest from across the country, internationally. The students are getting jobs. So even the students in the first cohort, I wasn't able to direct because the department needed me to chair the department. So we had an interim director, right? But I taught in the program, and I had students from the English department and the public humanities program in the class. And the students who came out of that cohort, I don't know every single one's result, but they got jobs in museums, they got jobs with foundations. They get back to me and tell me, and it does seem successful. I think what we need to do though is, and I'm not the director anymore, but track every student and figure out where they can go. It was really, in my class, I had them write a draft grant proposal, and they had to find an actual grant, which may or may not, the deadlines might not fit, right? Some of them actually submitted grants. One of them got funded with a small grant. But those grant proposals led to jobs. One student told me the reason I got my job was because I could tell her I had written a grant proposal. Right? And another student went directly from the grant proposal, which was for exhibit of Armenian art, something like that, into a job with that organization. So, those real world activities that were still very intellectually grounded were the ones that I think made the difference. Students did incredible projects. So evaluating their projects is one of the success parameters. And then for me, one of the biggest parameters is what else is the MA EPH doing? Like outside of us, what's happening? And what I think was happening was that the existence of that program and all the activities that led up to it shifted the conversation in Georgetown from a conversation that was like, we're interested in business school, we're interested in SFS, we don't care about the humanities that much, we need to have them because that's the kind of place we are, but, so suddenly the humanities had a higher profile. The new dean came in committed to developing the Humanities Center, and we started seeing developments all across the campus. So I put a couple projects here. These were projects from PhD students who did the certificate. This one and this one. So I'm going to go back to that certificate picture. Okay, so here's a day at the certificate, and you know, if there's like if we had not received approval for the masters, I would have been okay with that because I was so excited about how the certificate went. The certificate was 3 days, 2.5 days. We did a bunch of site visits to places in Washington that hire PhDs in the humanities. We had a speed dating thing with about 25 professionals from the area who had all had PhDs in the humanities. We had some speakers, and we had a workshop where students worked on their outreach projects. So, and the most notable thing about this was that the students came in, a number of them like visibly depressed and telling me how depressed they were. They were never going to get a job, they didn't know what they were going to do, they didn't have a path, and they were desperate, right? And by the time they left, they were so excited and upbeat and happy with, you know, the opportunities that were out there, and they had a way to move forward. Okay, and even if that way was, as I think one of the speakers told them, you know, it's not going to be just walk out and get a job. You need to do all kinds of outreach. You need to do networking. It takes about 6 months usually. Right? And they really took that and ran with it. And I kept hearing back again. I don't have all I have is anecdotal evidence, but I kept hearing back that this had worked for them. Okay, so and I love that picture. That's actually my assistant, Lauren Frey. And she took everything she learned from helping me with this program and went to a consulting firm. So, back to these projects. So some of the other concurrent things that were going on, and I think it was almost like a movement towards the humanities. They reinvent the humanities. We did a website and sort of lecture series and interviews with people. It was a pretty big project. I think it was useful at the time and not so much now. But interviews with undergraduates, right? So we started interviewing undergraduates to see what they thought the value of their degrees was. And what we learned was that they did not know that they were taking humanities courses, even though they were English majors. Okay? So they didn't really know what the humanities meant. They didn't know what it was doing for them. And they could not articulate the value of it. And I think I did 4 of those interviews, and the 4th one, the young lady started crying because she was on camera. And she just got so frustrated, and she just said, I don't know what it did for me. I just like to read. You know, so out of that, one of the projects that never came to fruition, but I think is so important, was creating a sort of first day packet for faculty to use on that first day of class when most people just go over the syllabus. To set up the class with the frame of the humanities. Okay, so what are the humanities? Why do we call it the humanities? What's included? What are the things? Just one class, right? And then the students at least have been exposed to the idea that this course is in the humanities, right? Whether it's in history, philosophy, or whatever. We started developing towards the Humanities Center. We now have the space laid out. Unbelievable at Georgetown. It's been I came in '94, we were working on this in '94. We never got a space until last year. And then the development of this public humanities program at our downtown campus, which is just starting. So it has an effect outside the actual degree. And then I put this here because it was my favorite thing that we did. Under the Mellon Fellowship, we went to the Lincoln Cottage, and we had this amazing young guy, who just loved Lincoln and loved the Lincoln Cottage, and he gave us a tour. And then we had a nice dinner there, and that was the end. Right, of ours. So the final thoughts, advice, if you want any. Usually I should say, do you want my advice? But patience, you know, you just have to have so much patience to really, really create some change and see some change happen. You can't really overestimate how threatened most faculty are by these kinds of changes. And you know what's interesting? More senior faculty are very threatened, but junior faculty that have just been hired are also very threatened by it. So, you know, you've just got to really try to help people feel safe, you know, go incrementally and being very, very patient. Other departments get extremely anxious, and my favorite story is about museum studies at Georgetown. They were sure that we were going to steal all their students. And they came into my office like really angry. And I said, you know what, our students are going to want to take some of your courses. And most of your courses are under-enrolled. So what's happened is now we have a great collaboration with museum studies. Probably half the MA and PH students take a course over there. And they mentor our students. And it's just rosy, you know, very unpredictable given the initial reaction. Performance and theater studies. Went to a meeting, their department meeting to present it, and their reaction was, you're just trying to get some money for the English department. Like, no, I mean, we weren't even in the English department anymore. But gradually over time they came around, and now Derek Goldman, who's very prominent in that department, is a big supporter. So you just, you know, keep explaining, explaining, explaining. And you hear the same questions over and over again. One of the hardest things to do in the grant for someone who's quite introverted, such as myself, is to do this outreach to the community. Right? And I did do quite a bit of outreach, lunches with people at the embassies, and you know, coffee with people at different nonprofits and things like that. But the more that you can do that, the better. And I think it would have been better if I had had sort of a team of grad students and other faculty also doing it. And finally, you know, it's really like, you wonder, like, what are these students going to do? You know, I should be able to shape some projects for them. But they, yeah, you're shaking your head. The students are going to be far more creative and interesting than the faculty ever will be, because they, you know, they don't have our training and they haven't been on our path, right? And they come up with the most amazing projects. So that is the way I kind of wanted to end this talk, was to rely on the students, because they're the